So my name is Ruth Bancewicz. I am the Church Engagement Director at the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion. This conference is actually 20 years since I started working for Christians in science. I was a development officer a long time ago for several years. And it's lovely to be here and see old friends and make new ones. So in this session, we have, just checking the timing before we start. Okay, we have, hang on, I'm still here. We have 45 minutes, that's the one. It's always good to know where you're going. We have 45 minutes to discuss a book which I am actually currently, I'm currently flagging as one of the books to read. If someone says, I always meant to think about science and faith, have you got a book? And your heart sinks. You think, just one? Come on, I've got a whole library of them, and they just want one. And this is one of those ones. And obviously, since it's just came out, is a very good one. Can I have my Exhibit A? Here we are. So it's called Playing God. And it came out of a project with the Faraday Institute. We've been collaborating with the CiS think tank for a number of years on a whole range of research projects, most of them, I think, led by Nick Spencer, our speaker here. It's been great working with them. We like data, they like producing data. And then there's all sorts of fun analysis, both numerical, empirical, and what's the word for the more subjective, looking at data? I've just lost it. There we go. And really fascinating, keeps me up to date, keeps me thinking about who we're actually reaching where people are in their thinking, and how we can do things that are relevant to them. So really vital. And let me introduce our two speakers. Sorry, this is what happens when you run a stand and chair a session at the same time. It's slightly messy, but David just told us that life was messy, and that's okay. Okay, we're all settled down now. So, Nick Spencer is a senior fellow, as I said, at the Religion and Society think tank called CiS, with a degree in English and history, and then a doctorate in political theology. Oh, been to Oxford and Cambridge, that's greedy. He is the host of the Reading Our Times podcast. I don't think they have funny games, so you can have a serious podcast to go with the less serious podcast, and then you've got a lovely broad look at the world. Author of a number of books, as I said, the recent one, Playing God. And then we also have Hannah Waite here, flown over from Northern Ireland just for today. She is a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the University of Leeds, doing research looking at a both-and approach to biological disorder and religious experience in relation to Christians who experience psychosis or mania. Her first degree was, not surprisingly, after that title, is psychology, with a doctorate in practical theology, both from the University of Aberdeen, where I also went, so hooray for Aberdeen. She has also obviously worked at the CiS think tank, where she was also involved. She's a co-author on this book, Playing God. So it was lovely to get to know her while she was working on that project with the Faraday Institute. And they also, the two of them, have a forthcoming book called The Landscapes of Science and Religion. What are we disagreeing about? And that's coming out with OUP. So is that, sorry, as a first opening question, if this is the give it to your pastor because they need to read a book on science and religion, / buy for someone in your family who wonders what you're on about with all this Christians and science, is the OUP one that's coming out, is that the sort of, there's more data, it's a bit more heavyweight academic version of it?
Playing God is the book that you find in your stocking on Christmas morning. Landscapes is under the tree, yeah?
Okay, all right, great, fantastic. Now, after that introduction, you both have a microphone. This is very dangerous. You can dive in at any point. Please dive in. Is there anything I missed out about you or the book that you would like to, or missed out in my introductions that you would like to add in?
I really like dogs.
It's on.
It's on, sorry. I just really like dogs, and I felt like everyone needed to know that before we went any further.
I'm a cat person.
And I can't have pets because they make me sneeze. So there you go. Now you know something about all of us. I feel like because we're in the round, I'm not quite sure. I want to see and have a conversation, but I also want to not turn my back on you. I'm not quite sure what to do. But anyway, so Hannah, let's dive in. We will have opened the floor for questions later on, but just to get things going, we'll have a bit of a conversation about this book. Hannah, do you want to tell us a bit about it? Describe this, what we're talking about.
I will try my hardest to describe it. Our book, Playing God, came out of thinking about the subjects in science and religion that are quite different from what a lot of us think about in science and religion, especially when I started getting involved in science and religion. Nick had to shoulder me along and teach me all about the history, and I thought, oh, this is interesting, but it's not as relevant as what's going on in the world today. So the book deals more with subjects that you find in the news, so a bit more about like gene editing, extension of life, which we found really interesting whenever we were doing our project and thinking about how people are trying to live longer, and how that actually relates to science and religion and what that looks like and how to live well. And actually a lot of the concepts and the different topics that we deal with in Playing God is a lot more about what does it mean to be human and how science and religion can interact in that space. And often that's where it's really interesting, is what does it mean to be human? So our different chapters we go through, we were trying to remember all 8 of them. Well, I was trying to remember all 8 of them earlier. And we're going through mental health, gene editing, animal personhood, abortion, vaccines. So we're trying to deal with big topics, but in a way that's engaging and in the 21st century. Anything to add, Nick?
I think that's absolutely right. I guess what I would add is that part of the book is born from a sense that we could well be entering a real golden age for science and religion. What I mean by that is this. The book I wrote before I worked with Hannah on Playing God was a history of science and religion, looking at the last 2,000 years or so. Covers a whole range of areas. One of the things that emerged from looking at the history of science and religion is that the conversation gets most interesting and most animated when the question of the human comes to the fore. What kind of creature is a human? How should we understand a human being? And the attendant question, who has the right to adjudicate on this? It seemed to us that actually that question is going to be of paramount importance in the 21st century, because our ability to understand, to manipulate, to quote-unquote improve the human has come on in extraordinary ways in the last half century. It shows no signs of abating, and it is going to kick up scientific progress of the nature that Hannah was talking about. It's going to kick up some very profound questions, not just ethical questions, what should we do, but metaphysical and anthropological questions and theological questions ultimately. Man, who are we? And so I think if done right, the next 80 years are an enormous opportunity for people who have expertise in that particular nexus to join a conversation that is being had every single day. I mean, you can't open the newspapers without a story on AI at the moment. It's a really live discussions. They're all live discussions. And I think it's an enormous opportunity for the science and religion community.
Yes, so the subtitle is Science, Religion and the Future of Humanity. So yes, really flagging up that where are we going? And actually one thing that grabbed me when I started reading this book was, I think it was in the introduction, you were saying, there are the topics that the science and religion world discusses, and then there are the topics that hit the headlines and quote-unquote ordinary people tend to ask and think about. And this book is the ordinary people question. So more the practical things that affect our lives and where we're going with them. Hannah, can I ask, can you just pull out briefly the part that grips you most that in writing and researching that book that got you going most?
I think it will be no surprise that it would have been, we have a section on mental health, and mental health is kind of my jam, shall we say. And I think a lot of it comes from, so in psychological literature, there's a lot of information that goes about how religion is good for your mental health, etc. And I'm not saying it's not, but thinking about that more deeply and what does it mean about, engaging with people taking medication, what different types of medication look like for people. And the other area that I actually find most interesting when I'm not in that kind of mental health discipline, and I feel like I talk about that a lot, so I'm keeping that short and sweet, is that idea of extension of life. We did in our big research project a large quantitative survey of, 5,000 UK adults, population representative, and asked people about what do they think about if they could take a pill to be moral, or different things about extending life. And I think I just find it really interesting that some of us would want to extend life and think about playing God in that way. And the amount of money and billions of dollars that are poured into that, I find really, really interesting to think about, and think about that it's the 0.01% of people who have the money that are thinking about living longer, and thinking about what would it mean to live longer, and why would we want to live longer, what does that mean for the world, etc. So that's a very long-winded way of saying a lot of things are very interesting in it, but they were probably the two main areas I found.
Really interesting data. Yeah. How long do you want to live, Hannah?
I think like 100's good. It's like a nice round number. I don't know, I think 100 still seems a bit greedy to me. But that's my aim, is 100 with also 100 dogs. Because that's
100 dogs.
Yeah, that's important.
What about you, Nick? How long are you going to live?
It rather depends what time of day you ask me, I've got to be honest with you.
Okay. And whether you're on a stage. So Nick, what's the reaction been so far? Have there been any surprises or pleasing moments?
I guess the word I'm searching for here is subdued. The reviews have been really positive so far, and I've done a number of talks on the subject. I guess the most interesting reaction is, firstly, that people are slightly surprised that, there's a religious perspective on AI, or there's a religious perspective on gene editing or life extension. And secondly, then when you have a conversation with people, it begins to fall into place. So to take the example that Hannah picked up there, life extension, promises to live to 120, 160, so on and so forth. But actually, that disguises a fundamental question about what is life. Is the life of a human being simply the continued existence as a physical organism on a planet, or is there some other concept to it? Now, theologically, there is definitely another concept to it, because life is life in relationship. So the question of how long you want to live is very differently answered according to whether you're thinking of the existence of this physical frame or the existence of the relationships that make me the person, to use a technical theological term, the person that I am. And David mentioned some literature earlier. We quote in that chapter a lovely story written by Julian Barnes in a novel about 30 years ago, in which he dreams that he is in heaven and has eternal life. And ultimately, I will spoil the story for you, but it is worth reading. He decides to switch off and to die voluntarily, and he discovers that everybody who is given this option for eternal life decides to switch off eternally. Now, on the surface of it, it's quite an anti-religious story, you think, but it's actually profoundly very pro-religious, because the point that the narrator makes in the story is that that kind of eternal life, without some kind of transformation, actually becomes hellish in the end. It becomes a perpetuation of everything that's going on here. For humans to be worthy of eternal life, not quite the language that Julian Barnes uses. We need to be transformed in some way. We're getting into deep theological territory here. And time and again, what you see in the book is the science is moving its tanks onto that theological lawn.
Yes, yeah. And I love the way in the book that in each of the chapters you have come to a conclusion. It's not necessarily enormously clear-cut. You're not telling people what to think, but you have brought it to a place where Christian faith has a very positive contribution and is telling a very different story. And also, the other thing I appreciated about this book is that it's a great updating. Those of us who've been around the block for a long time, it's very hard to keep up to date on all these topics. This is a good up-to-date update on a whole wide range of topics with data and the latest books and things. It's very useful. And some of those fields are moving very, very fast. And Hannah, do you have any comments about those fields that are moving very fast? Any of them, where they're going, what they're doing, maybe in your own field of mental health? We're all aware of huge challenges, whether it's the next generation with phones in their hand, or people who are struggling with long COVID, or different changes in people's mental health, or awareness of mental health. Where's it going?
That's a really good question. I think I'm going to need to think. I'm not as quick as Nick off the bat on questions. I need to think about things a wee bit longer. Do you mind repeating the way in which you phrased it first? Is that okay?
So it's some of the fields in this book are moving incredibly fast. Mental health is an area where we've had some changes recently. Social media effect on Generation Z, for example. With your insights, where are we now since this book went to press a year ago, maybe? Or where are we going?
I feel like we're in a little bit more of a dire state, which sounds awful. But I do think in general, so specifically thinking about social media and the way in which, one of the things that Nick put really well there was thinking about what does it mean to be human, and to be human is to live in relationship and is to flourish, especially in a Christian belief, right? It's to live in community with one another. And I think one of the things that's becoming more and more apparent, even within the realm of mental health and in society today, is the fact that a lot of people don't live in relationship with one another and don't live in relationship with one another well and take care of what it means to flourish. So you see that through the likes of, as you're saying, people sitting on their phones, even in the fact that GPs are now doing a thing called social prescribing, where they're trying to get people to engage with one another. And I think if we're thinking about what does it mean to be human and what does it mean, or what makes us human, actually that idea of relationships and the breakdown of relationships between people, not saying that makes us less human, but it actually leads us to really question, well, how do we begin to really pour into relationships in a society that's really fast moving, that's very me-centric and egocentric? And I think that, that's probably in mental health where you see a big leap forward at the moment is actually loneliness and the amount of people who don't know how, not know how to, but are lonely and struggling to connect with others. And I think that actually within the area of mental health, that's just going to continue to grow, unfortunately. And, just for the people who are church leaders here, I think that that's an area in which we should be trying to engage with more and not shying away from. And it's okay to say, actually, I don't really know much about this and I need to go and learn more about how to support people and engage with that topic.
Yes, how would you frame your sermon series on mental health or well-being? Amazing. We had a couple in my church that did that. A GP, came and did that, which was really helpful. Yeah. Nick, do you want to, thinking of fast-moving areas and maybe chapters that were difficult to pin down and say, stop, we can send this off to press. Where were they?
The obvious one is AI, as I mentioned earlier, which seems to make significant headlines on a weekly basis. But actually, I think there's a lot of hype there in the first instance. It makes good copy, doesn't mean it's going to be as revolutionary as the changes are as revolutionary as sometimes people make out. Also, the last chapter in the book is about, and begins with Bill Clinton on the lawn of the White House announcing the decoding of the human genome in 1999, I think it was, and making these quite extravagant promises about the way in which this would completely revolutionize medicine. And some of the commentary I read about this 25 years later saying actually not as much of an advance in the last 25 years as people were thinking there would be. Doesn't mean there won't be in the next 25 years or so. So there's certainly been progress there, but it's tentative. I guess the one chapter in the book where it could be transformed overnight, there's a chapter on alien life. We get communication tomorrow from Alpha Centauri or whatever it is. That chapter is probably going to have to be rewritten because there's a lot of new data there. But I guess one of the points we're trying to make is this. Some of these fields are moving quite quickly, some of them slightly slower, some of them might be transformed. But they're kicking up questions that are always there. And they have always been there for hundreds and thousands of years. They invite questions about the meaning of life. The chapter on alien life picks up this question of the relationship between uniqueness and value. There's a presupposition so many people have that value lies in uniqueness. Humans are unique, therefore they're valuable. Alien life turns up, humans are no longer unique, therefore they're not valuable. Now that is not a theological position I would put to you, but it does invite this question of, okay, where does value reside? On what basis can you call human beings valuable? As Hannah points out, the question of mental health picks up, the chapter on mental health picks up the relationship there is between our physical presence and our mental well-being, and our physical and embodied social presence. This is a hugely significant issue. The penny dropped for us on that particular chapter, looking through a data set for the Office for National Statistics, giving the relationship between reported levels of mental ill health and the cost of living crisis. And it will stun nobody here to hear that there is a significant positive correlation, we would call it, between levels of poor mental ill health and inability to pay gas bill, electricity bill, pay the rent, being unemployed, so on and so forth. But right at the top of this ONS datasheet, there was a warning which said, this paper charts the relationship between mental ill health and cost of living crisis. We do not suggest there is any correlation or causal relationship between the two. Now, the ONS have to say that because they don't want to be political, but it's very obviously the case that if you're unemployed, you're a long-term carer, you can't pay the bills, that's part of the wider trend there is. We talk in the chapter about the pharmacological treatment of mental health, seeing mental health as primarily a pharmacological or a neurological issue, rather than a both-and approach, which is what Hannah's research looks at. This, again, is a perennial issue. So even if the science changes significantly there, we're going to find ourselves having these deeper conversations that have been around for a long time. So I guess I'm saying I wouldn't be anxious about the speed of change.
Good, thank you. And so speaking into this particular group, lots of people, well, presumably nearly everyone involved in their own church as a scientist or retired scientist or student, and many people giving talks, writing, or beginning to do that kind of thing. How would you speak into this group to help them to engage with science and Christian faith in their own communities in a helpful way?
I'm loath to tell people what their proper response should be, because every response is going to necessarily be different. But if, and as far as any advice I have, it's to listen before you speak. I mean, that's platitudinous, but sometimes does need to be said. I guess this whole book came from a sustained listening exercise that Hannah and I conducted. This other book that's coming out beginning of next year, which seeks to understand why people think there is a tension between science and religion. And we did so by listening to over 100 scientists, philosophers of science, sociologists of science, theologians, so on and so forth. to understand what they thought was the problem in order to try and fully kind of map that. This is different, this book, but it's not dissimilar in the sense that it's listening to what are the kind of science stories that we're likely to find in the press at the moment, and trying to understand the perspective that they evoke, that they bring out. So that's a listening exercise. And as a rule, I think listening exercises are the best ways of beginning any fruitful conversation.
Yeah, and just to add on that, I think going back to what Nick's saying about listening, I think there's also an element of having an air of academic hospitality in that, and listening to people as part of that, and welcoming other people's ideas and thoughts into that, and being, I suppose, brave and saying, let's think about these things together, rather than, as you're saying, having an actual idea or a definitive answer, but maybe exploring that through a Bible study or a group together. And looking at one of these topics might be helpful. I'm not saying to use the book to look at one of the topics, but if you want to do that, that'll boost sales, right, Nick? But yeah, I think that might be helpful, but listening, and I think actually being okay with not having a definitive answer and exploring things together might be helpful. Obviously, if you have a definitive answer, that's great, but sometimes the journey of discovering things with people and leading someone to think about things in a new way is really profitable.
Yes, I do think this would be a good book club book, I have to say, or a home group Lent study or something, go through a chapter each week and discuss it together. So just running down the list of topics we have in this book: life, extending life, extraterrestrial life, and vaccinations, personhood, and animal personhood, AI, mental health, early life, abortion, and gene editing. Lots of amazing topics. Is there anything, if you'd been able to fit in another chapter, that you would have put in, Hannah? Is there anything you'd have wanted to see in there that you wish you had done?
I'm okay with just what's
You're okay
in there, yeah.
With
I think that would have been a lot of extra reading and trying to gain more knowledge on a new scientific discipline that I probably wouldn't have had time or the brain capacity to be able to do.
Okay, comprehensive enough. Nick, would you add anything in?
Well, there's a lot in there. I wouldn't have put this topic in because when we were writing the book a year or so ago, it wasn't on the horizon. It's not so much on the horizon now as right in the midst of us, which is assist dying.
Oh,
that
yeah.
has come out of nowhere. Legislatively, that has come out of nowhere. That wouldn't quite fit in the sense of actually there is no significant technological development that would mean it's an obvious choice for a chapter, but it is seen as a medical process, and it is a live issue which I'm working on this at CiS at the moment, focuses on, the whole debate in one sense turns on one particular word, which is the meaning of dignity. Dignity is used by both sides in this debate, but interestingly in radically different ways. One is effectively dignity is fulfilled through autonomy, it's a sort of Kantian position. The other is dignity is filled through relationships, which is a more Christian theological position. So it's not a particularly technical issue, but it is one that, like the other issues in there, goes right into the heart of these perennial anthropological questions of who we are as persons, that I think, if necessary, you could crowbar in there.
Great, yeah. And can you give us a sneaky preview of the new book? Is there anything you want to tell us about that?
So, it is meaningless. This is going to be a controversial statement to everyone here. Sorry. It's absolutely meaningless to say, I think science and religion are compatible. And it's also meaningless to say, I think science and religion are incompatible, unless you have done some work to define what you mean by science and what you mean by religion. It has often been remarked that Ken Ham, say, a noted creationist, and Richard Dawkins are fully in agreement that evolution and religion are incompatible, but they do so for rather different reasons. Unless you begin to define your terms, it's hard to know what you're actually saying. But the business of trying to define what science is and what religion is very messy. We heard last night Peter Harrison's excellent book, The Territories of Science and Religion, that points out that those categories shifted enormously throughout Western intellectual
It's officially
history.
Similar title.
We nicked it. I mean, Peter knows about this. That Peter's book, Territories, was one of the reasons for our Templeton project in the first instance.
Fine. Okay.
His book ends at the 19th century, so by this time we had relatively established understandings in the academy of what science and religion meant. But be that as it may, people still use science and religion in very different terms. So what we have done, the book is called The Landscapes of Science and Religion, because if Territories is viewing something from above, Landscapes is viewing it from an eye level. We spoke to a large number of people to try and get an idea of the ways in which science is understood and used, and similarly religion. And then in the light of that, what exactly are people disagreeing about? What are the perceived tension points? And then as we work through them, why are they not tension points, or why there might be some legitimate area for tension in there? And it's just worth ending on the point that actually, often when I do talks about this, I come to the conclusion saying, actually, yeah, there are points of disagreement. I mean, one of the points in the second part of the book looks at the importance of naturalism. I won't sort of bore you with this, but as a philosophical doctrine, and the extent to which that is necessary for science, and whether it has to be methodological naturalism, and what kind of supernaturalism or non-naturalism is religion committed to. You get right into the weeds. But the point is, in any intellectual discipline, issues are always live. There are always disagreements. There are plenty of disagreements in any scientific discipline, just as there are in discipline in the humanities. That's not anything to be worried about. You don't have to aim at perfect harmony. A bit of friction, a bit of tension is actually a healthy sign in any academic discipline.
And we'll look out for it. That's coming out in February, is it? Yes. And Hannah, do you want to add anything to that? Any fun bits, interesting bits, things that you enjoyed working on?
I think one of the things I find the most interesting, as Nick said, we interviewed over 100 academics, so people who are biologists, chemists, worked in medical ethics, etc. And the sheer difference in how different scientists define science, I find really interesting. You know, a lot of people were very much on that kind of scientific worldview that empirical claims are the most important, and that's what truth is. And I think that, yeah, that was what struck me the most, I think, as someone who's not a scientist, or maybe as a social scientist. And, you know, a lot of what we're talking about today is physical sciences, and I would probably be more in the social sciences. So I think that was one of the things I find the most interesting, is that there's not even agreement among scientists, or even scientists in the same discipline, was some of the things I find the most interesting. Yeah.
There's one other sort of point worth mentioning. In the 5,000 sample quantitative survey of the general public that we did as part of this project, broadly speaking, the public opinion of the compatibility and incompatibility of science is 1 to 2. So roughly speaking, a third of people would veer towards science and religion being compatible, and 2/3 incompatible. So the conflict narrative lives on in rude health. Amongst our experts, it was reversed. So roughly 2/3 of them thought there was some form of compatibility between science and religion, and 1/3 thought there were incompatibility. But we deliberately recruited these people to be disproportionately non-religious, non-church attending, and atheistic. So they were much higher levels of atheism than the public as a whole. Now, I think that's very, very interesting. We were not expecting that at all. It tends to suggest to me that the more you know about these subjects, even if you don't have a personal faith yourself, the more you realise there are certain nuances there which allow for some kind of profitable dialogue, some form of compatibility. Whereas the less you know, The more you just graduate to the default position is, well, yeah, of course they're incompatible. Paradoxically, I think that's a really good sign that shows that, even though the default narrative is conflict, tension, the more people know, the more that default position is slowly unwound.
Yes, yeah. No, and I certainly quote these kind of figures in my talks. And if you like numbers and you want to look into them, and also the richer data from the interviews, you can, on the Faraday Institute website, there's a whole page full of reports from this study. And there's also a hard copy. There's one copy left of the hard copy report from this. You can buy it for £5 on the Faraday stall. We also have a lot of copies of Playing God if you need them for yourself or for Christmas presents. Now, I did promise we would have questions. So we've got 8 minutes left. So if you have a brief question about this book or any of the topics that have come up, I think someone will come over to you with a microphone. Sam, I'll just let you decide who you want to give it to. There you go.
Thank you very much. It's on. I have a question actually for Hannah. I was just thinking, there's been a lot of books out recently and articles about the correlation between the decline of good mental health in young people and the rise of social media and smartphones in particular. And I just wondered, would you want to speculate about this correlation is to do with causation as well? How does your own work reflect on that correlation that has been reported so much recently?
So my own work currently isn't in that sphere, but I do think that there is, and I'm thinking more from personal experiences, that there is definitely something going on there with people not knowing how to connect with one another when you're talking about, that causation of, say, people being on their phones and declining mental health in youth. I also think that the pandemic actually had a huge part to play in that, of people not being in school, not learning social skills. And I think that you're seeing that outworking as well with younger people when they're not, in those developmental ages in which they would learn how to share at school or talk about different topics, and they actually don't know how to engage in that because they sat at home with a computer learning for a while, which obviously we had to do to keep everyone safe. But I think that a lot of social skills as well have maybe not lacked, but haven't been able to develop as quickly as maybe they would have if they'd been in school. And that then compounds the issue of, okay, well, I don't know how to connect with people face to face, so I'll try and do it on the internet. But I look at the internet and I see more and more people are out doing X, Y, and Z together, and I compare myself to that, and it just becomes this really vicious cycle, especially for youth. But it would be an area I'd be more interested in developing or getting into in like youth mental health. So, future funders who are out there, if you ever want to give me money to do something like that, that would be fabulous.
Thank you, Hannah. Right, next question.
What's your take on mental health and demon possession? I think, obviously, Jesus talked about demon possession. Did you find in the patients that you interviewed that there was a feeling that there was actually a kind of spiritual entity kind of making him do stuff, or are they happy with the kind of chemical storm kind of model?
So I didn't interview any patients for this Playing God book. I think that that's a very live and difficult debate. One thing that I really appreciate that one of my mentors talks about is that sometimes we pay more attention to the demonic that happens in Hollywood and how that's presented than we do to Jerusalem. And I think that there is obviously a lot of things going on there, and that is actually one of the things I'm hoping to tease out. I haven't started interviewing people. I'm only a month in. I'm waiting for ethical approval to go and talk to people yet. But I think that we have to tread very carefully in saying that it's demon possession to people, because that can do, if they have a biomedical understanding of their own mental health, saying actually you're possessed, and I've interviewed people who've been tied down for exorcisms and stuff against their will, is really, really damaging to them as a person, damaging to them in their faith. And I think that we need to try and understand a way in which other people tell their own story and come to understand that, and look at what that means for them to be well, and us not just tell people what it means for them to be well. I think we need to give people a bit more autonomy and actually the way in which we sometimes understand mental health or tell someone they should understand their own mental health does a lot of injustice to someone's own narrative. So I'm going to get to the demon possession stuff hopefully in this project or maybe later, but I think that I've just tried to not avoid it, but I think that sometimes it can be a really problematic dichotomy in which to place people in, and it can be really damaging, as I say, to people's faith and to a community's faith as well.
Sorry to bring it up, but it is one of the big live issues in the American election. I wonder if you could just say something about your chapter on abortion.
I will give that to Nick.
Yeah, being a bloke, that's right, that's perfect for me. The chapter begins saying, why would you do it? I mean, why would you write a book about AI and alien intelligence and animal personhood and then put a chapter on abortion in there? Because you're going to upset somebody, 50% of the people. Right, okay. The point about why that chapter was in there was this, which is that the ability to see what we call in the chapter after the psalmist, the unformed body, has come, as in the preborn child, has come on enormously in the last 50 years or so. And in researching the book, we came across extraordinary examples of surgery being conducted on fetuses in the womb. The debate in the US, like debate everywhere, descends to slogans pretty quickly, and you're either pro-choice or you're pro-life. And the point we try to make in the chapter is that both of those terms are really question-begging. And you have to define exactly what you mean by life and exactly what are the conditions of choice. Because simply saying I'm pro-choice, people who are pro-choice don't tend to be pro-sex-selective abortion, for example. Well, in that case, you're not fully pro-choice. You have criteria around your choice. So again, it's an issue of defining your terms. And with regards to the pro-life position, the debate often falls onto the idea of viability, whether a fetus is able to survive outside the womb. But that is then predicated on a certain idea of what is worth protecting or not. And it's also predicated on the idea that humans are ultimately independent creatures. And we're not independent creatures at all. And similarly, it does seem to be slightly paradoxical, shall we say, that the same hospital can be conducting abortions in one wing and yet spending a huge amount of money on saving the life of an unborn child in another wing through quite interventionist activities, quite interventionist operations. So again, we don't kind of, I'm not going to speak for Hannah, and I don't particularly want to speak for my own position here because it wasn't a campaigning chapter, as it were. But what it's trying to do is to recognise that the idea of abortion is predicated on the extent to which we may or may not identify with the entity in question and the extent to which they are part of a wider human community, and our ability to see into the womb, to operate, to engage, to know the health of an unborn child has inadvertently, I guess, brought the unborn closer into the community of the born, of the living. And that then should cause us give some cause for reflection on how we then treat the unborn. I guess that would be my answer.
May I ask a question, actually?
I'm afraid I'm going to pull stumps. I'm so sorry. I'll draw stumps. Whatever you're supposed to do, not a cricket player. I don't know why I'm using a cricket analogy. It's 12:36 and the short paper talk started a minute ago. So I think we're going to thank our speakers who've worked incredibly hard on a huge range of topics. Let's thank them very much. We are looking forward to buying your book for everyone we know for Christmas. And also looking out for the next book that's coming out in February. Thank you so much. And let's head off to either of the two places. I think is it here and also in the other room. Thank you.